Today we're going to be learning Masechet Beitzah Daf Yud Zayin. Today's learning is sponsored by Leora and Marty Feinberg in memory of Miriam Adler, Leora's mother, on her third Yurtzeit, whose Yurtzeit was on Yom Kippur. As a young girl, she begged her father to teach her Gemara so she could expand her knowledge. She would have loved to know that her daughter and daughter-in-law are pursuing that path. We're going to start now at the top of our daf, second line, Tanu Rabbanan. So we're starting again, very relevant issues, although this is a little less relevant to this coming yantif, which is Yom Tov Shechal Yop Shabbat. We're veering for a brief veer off of the topic of Erev Tavshilin, and we're going into how do we daven? What do we do in davening? Where do we put Yom Tov? Where do we put Shabbat when Yom Tov and Shabbat come out on the same day? So Yom Tov Shechal Yop Shabbat. Beit Shammai Omrim, again, Beit Shammai Beit Hillel Machloket. Beit Shammai Omrim Mitpalel Shmone ve'omer shel Shabbat b'fnei atzma v'shel Yom Tov b'fnei atzma. Right, again, this is something that you don't see happening, but Beit Shammai held that you do two separate blessings in the middle. Right? We combine them, but according to Beit Shammai, first you say the bracha of Shabbat, Mekadesh Shabbat, and then you make the bracha of Yom Tov, Mekadesh Yisrael v'Hazmanim. Beit Hillel Omrim Mitpalel Sheva. No, you only do 7. Again, every time we say 7 or 8, it's because there's 3 in the beginning, 3 in the end, and then the 1 in the middle, or maybe 2 in the middle. So he says only 1 in the middle. Matchil b'shel Shabbat u'masayim b'shel Shabbat. You start with the issue of Shabbat. You finish with the concept of Shabbat. V'omer kedushat hayom be'emtza. And you say the kedushat hayom be'emtza, meaning you start off, okay, Rashi even says this, if you look in Rashi, Matchil b'shel Shabbat, bracha achad l'shnehem, I'm on the second line of Rashi, u'matchil l'hazkir Shabbat tchila, v'titem lanu et yom hamenucha hazeh, ve'et yom chag ploni hazeh. Two interesting things in Rashi. First of all, it's just telling us, what does it mean you start with it? It just means that the first thing you say when you say Vatitan Lanu, God gave us, which is the language used for Yantif, well, God gave us the Shabbat, and he gave us Yantif, and this is in fact what we do. But notice what he says at Yom HaMenucha Hazeh, right? He has a different version. We don't say that. We say at Yom HaShabbat Hazeh. He calls it this day of rest, okay, like with a descriptor instead of actually saying Shabbat. So it's just interesting because he obviously had a different version than we have. And then when you say the bracha, you say Mekadesh Shabbat, and you can see Rashi just so you don't get confused. Bishal Shabbat, Mekadesh Shabbat betulo, and that's it. Also not what we do, right? We don't say Mekadesh Shabbat. We say Mekadesh Shabbat Yisrael v'Hazmanim. Okay, he says you just say Mekadesh Shabbat. So he says, Shabbat is the main thing here. Yantif, gets added in the middle, but we end with the idea of Shabbat. So why do we do what we do? Well, that's because of Rebbe. Rebbe Omer, we have a third opinion here. Again, Rebbe's a later generation. He comes in and comments on Beit Hillel after, and he says, no, you also add in Yantif into the end, in the bracha. And you say, you combine both the idea of Shabbat and the idea of Yisrael v'Hazmanim. Why Yisrael v'Hazmanim? We'll see this in another minute, but I'll already tell you in case you don't know, which is because God is Mekadesh Shabbat, right? He determined, sanctifies Shabbatot, because that was from the creation of the world. The 7th day is always Saturday, and is always the Shabbat. And Yisrael v'Hazmanim, though, the holidays get determined by us, because we determine when the calendar is, that's going to determine when the holidays fall out. So now, that's what Rebbe would finish with. However, Tana Kamed Ravina, there was a person who brought Beitzah in front of Ravina, and his version in Rebbe was Mikadesh Yisrael v'Hashabbat v'Hazmanim. Okay, he has God sanctifies the Jewish people and the Shabbat and the times. Seems to be a different meaning, maybe in a different order. Amarle, Ravina says to him, but it sounds like Mikadesh Yisrael, or you could read it like this: Mikadesh Yisrael Hashabbat v'Hazmanim. Although the vav there is a little bit strange. There's also an extra vav besides the order of the words is switched. There's a vav in between Yisrael and v'Hashabbat, right? Where it's opposed to before we had Mikadesh Hashabbat Yisrael without a vav. Okay, I don't know the significance of the vav, but anyway, I'm just pointing that out. So he says Mikadesh Yisrael v'Hashabbat v'Hazmanim. Amar le, Ravina says to him, Atu Shabbat Yisrael Makachele. This is what I said just before. The Jews aren't the ones who are sanctifying the Shabbat, and therefore the Mekadesh Yisrael should go with the Hazmanim, and Mekadesh Shabbat should go separate. The God is the one who's Mekadesh Shabbat. Right? You say, Baruch Atah Hashem, blessed is God who sanctifies Shabbat. So therefore, right, HaShabbat Mekadesh B'Kaima. Shabbat is always sanctified whether or not we do something. So Ela Ema, so therefore he says, Ravina says, you obviously have it wrong. You should say Mekadesh Shabbat, Yisrael v'Hazmani. Right, that God sanctifies the Shabbat, and then you shouldn't have a vav really, because God sanctifies Shabbat and Yisrael and the times, right? But it's that the Jews sanctify the time, but also God sanctifies the Jews, because that's how I understand it. So Amar Rav Yosef, halacha kerebi ukeditaretz Ravina. And Rav Yosef says the halacha is like Rebbe, and in the version, the way Ravina explained it, and not in the version of the Beitzah that was brought before Ravina. That sounds like a very simple line. Okay, we paskin that way, simply and done. However, that line has some issues with it, or one major issue, which is, does it make sense that Rav Yosef would say, okay, this is sometimes you have to zoom out and kind of look at, wait, something's wrong here. Okay, you look at a very simple line, you think it's very easy to read and understand, but there's a problem because Rav Yosef lived 2 generations before Ravina. So it doesn't make sense that Rav Yosef would say, the halacha is like Rebbe, the way Ravina explains. So the commentaries are all struggling with this. There's a few explanations brought. One is to say that Ravina is not the same Ravina, and there's 2 Ravinas, and one was an earlier generation before Rav Yosef. Some people claim that's what it is, and it was a different Ravina. Ravina, we know, is Rav Yosef was 3rd generation, and right, he was the rabbi of Abaye, if you remember. And Abaye is 4th generation, and Ravina goes with Rav Ashi as Sof Hora'ah. They're the ones who basically put together, edited the Gemara. So they're 6th generation. So either this is some other Ravina. Some people say this is some other Rav Yosef. And that in Rav Shira Gaon's book, he lists a Rav Yosef or Rav Yossi or something that lived in the Sforaitic time period, which is the time period right after the Gemara was finished. And maybe that's what it is. And the third option is, Gita, you're suggesting, which is maybe it's the Gemara is giving, Rav Yosef really just said, halacha kirebi. And the Gemara is saying, kiditaritz Ravina, as Ravina explained. And that's like in addition, and particularly maybe if Ravina edited the Gemara, or maybe those who came after him and edited knew about Ravina and this problem in the Girsa that only came up after Rav Yosef was living. And therefore, they added, by the way, it's the way Ravina explains it and not the other way. So that's a third way of explaining it. So these are all different possibilities. But again, I wanted to just show you methodologically that sometimes there's a line that looks very simple. But when you start to understand who the people are and when they lived, something about it doesn't exactly make perfect sense. And then you have to rethink, how did this line come about? Tanu Rabbanan. Since we're on the topic of tefillah, we're now going to discuss off of Yantif for a minute. Shabbat shechal liot berosh chodesh. If Shabbat falls on Rosh Chodesh, or b'cholosh HaMoed, or on Chol HaMoed, Arvit v'Shacharit u'Mincha mitpalel Sheva, ve'omer me'ena me'ora ba'avodah. What do you do with Yala v'Yavo? Where do you put it? Okay, so do you put it in according to the first Tana? We're going to see 3 opinions. When it comes to Arvit, Shacharit, u'Mincha, we'll get to Musaf in a minute. You say 7 blessings, and you say Yala v'Yavo in Ritzei, the bracha of Ritzei, which talks about the avodah. That we've seen, right? That's what we do on a regular day. And this is also what we do on Shabbat. This is the opinion we hold by. V'im lo amal, and if you didn't say Ya'alev Yavo, machzirin oto, you have to repeat Shmona Esrei. This is true on any time Rosh Chodesh falls. If you forget Ya'alev Yavo, you have to start again. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, behoda'ah. Rabbi Eliezer says, no, it goes into the bracha of hoda'ah, modim. And Rashi points out, just like alanisim. Same way you add alanisim on Purim and Chanukah, you add Rosh Chodesh in that blessing. Ube musafin, but when it comes to musaf, and this seems to be according to both the Tanakama and Rabbi Eliezer, comes to musaf, matchil b'shel Shabbat u'mesayim b'shel Shabbat, v'omer kedushat hayom be'emtza. You do on. Now we understand why this came up, because it was just like we talked about Yantif. Yantif and Shabbos coincide. So what do we do according to Rabbi, right? We say both, right? And although he says more like Beit Hillel, which is you start with Shabbat, you end with Shabbat, and you say Kedushat Hayom Be'emtza. Okay, and you put in the Kedushat Hayom in the middle. This is in fact what we do, although we end with also Roshei Chodeshim. And this is why do we make a difference Musaf or not? Well, also on a weekday, right? Ya'alev Yavo goes in Avoda, but when it comes to Musaf, it's the central bracha, because Musaf is all about the korbanot of that day. And what are you talking about? The korbanot of that day. Rosh Chodesh has its own korbanot. Shabbat has their own korbanot. That obviously has to be in the middle bracha. We're not just making a mention that there was Rosh Chodesh, like a Ya'alev Yavo mention, but we actually want to talk about the sacrifices of the day. That's what the middle bracha is all about. So of course, we're going to put it in the middle. But now we're going to have a third opinion. Rashbam v'Rav Yishmael ben Osher Rabbi Yochanan ben Borok omrim, kol makom she'uzkak l'sheva. Anytime we have 7 blessings, like on a Shabbat, or, let's say Yantif falls out Rosh Chodesh also, although that would never happen. So forget that. I don't know why he says Kol Makom Shus Kakol Sheva, because I guess it's really only Shabbat. Matchil b'shel Shabbat, u'mesayim b'shel Shabbat, v'omer kedushat hayom be'emtza. I guess what he's trying to say is all the times, meaning when Shabbat and Yom Tov coincide, and when Shabbat and Rosh Chodesh coincide. In other words, what he's basically saying, now I realize, he's basically equating it to our previous case. And what he's saying is just like there, whenever we have 7, we stick whatever it is together with Shabbat. Therefore, we're going to do the same thing here. So that means that he's going to say Shabbat Rosh Chodesh in all the tefillot. We're going to basically put Rosh Chodesh together with Shabbat in the middle bracha, which is obviously not what we do. And in fact, you're going to see in the Gemara, Amar Rav Huna en halacha koto azuk. Rav Huna says, we don't paskin like that pair. That pair are the two of them, Rashbag and Rabbi Shmuel ben Osher Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, who said that last comment. Okay, and that's why in the end, we do it in Avodah. We don't paskin like Rabbi Eliezer either. I don't know why he doesn't tell us that, but we don't paskin that way. Okay. Now we're back to Erev Tavshilin. Amar Rav Chia bar Ashi Amar Rav. Meiniach Adam eruvei tchumim miyom tov lechavero. Okay, we're obviously talking about 2 days of Yantif in Chutz La'aretz, okay, outside of Israel. We have 2 days. So if you want to do an Erev Tchumin, you can make a condition from one day to the other. Now, Rashi explains, even though it's not what it says in the Gemara, Rashi explains that what we're talking about is when you have Yantif on Thursday, Friday, and you want to make an Erev Tchumin for Shabbat. So Rashi says, what do? He says, if you look Miyom Tov L'Chavero, okay, right there on the same line in Rashi, it appears, Im Nizkar B'Yom Tov Rishon, V'chalu Shnei Yamim Tovim Chamishi V'Erev Shabbat, Umatneh, and you say the following. How do you do it? You say, Im Hayom Chol Umachar Kodesh, right? If this first day is a regular day, and tomorrow, Friday, is the holiday, and it's also Erev Shabbat, so Eruvi Eruv. Well, then my Eruv is fine because I'm standing on Erev Yantif. Of course, I can make an Eruv. The Im Chiluf, and if that's not the case, and today is Yantif, Eini Tzarich La'arev Tavshilin. Okay, that's for Erev Tavshilin, but we'll get to that one in a minute. Ubitchumin Yomal, when it comes to Tchumin, he has to, okay, we're going to see in a minute, they're going to talk about Erev Tavshilin also. You could do the same thing. Maybe I'll read it inside first, and then we'll go back because we'll discuss what the differences are. You can do the same thing with Erev Tavshilin. Erev Tavshilin, you only need to make the condition on day number 1. That's what Rashi explains. You say the first day, if today is Yantif, then I'm not doing anything, because why? Well, then tomorrow is not Yantif, and of course I could cook for Shabbat. If today, right, because you really need your Eruv on the day before Shabbat, right? If today is not Yantif and tomorrow's Yantif, then I'm making an Eruv, and then tomorrow that will be my Eruv. It's perfect because I did it today, which isn't Yantif, and Shabbat I'll be able to cook Friday for Shabbat. That's very simple. That's all you have to do. 1 Eruv on the first day. But Erev Tchumin, you have to do more. Why? Because your Erev Tchumin is for Shabbat. Now, if you say if today's Yantif, then I can't make it, then I'm not doing anything, well, then you're stuck. Then you really didn't make an Erev Tchumin because you can't make an Erev Tchumin on Yantif. So he says the following. He says, well, if you do it for Tchumin, you're going to have to do an Eruv on the second day also. So you have to do the first day and say, right, again, if today is not Yantif, then this is perfect. And I'm preparing my Eruv for tomorrow, which will click in tomorrow on Yantif for Shabbat, right? The whole idea is he wants to walk on Shabbat. If today is Yantif, then I'm not doing anything. And then the next day, you do the same thing. And Rashi says, Ubeota hapat atzma. You use the exact same bread, and you say on that exact same bread, if today is Yantif, then I'm not doing anything. What I did yesterday worked. And if today is not Yantif and yesterday was Yantif, then what I did yesterday doesn't count, right? But what I'm doing now will work because today is not Yantif and I can make my Erev Tchumin for Shabbat. So that's the way Rashi explains this. The Tzlach asks 2 questions, and I don't have an answer for it, but he has 2 good questions on Rashi. Number 1, he says, why are you assuming when it comes to Erev Tchumin, when it comes to Erev Tavshilin, it's obvious that we're talking about Thursday, Friday, Shabbat. Otherwise, there's no point to doing Erev Tavshilin. It's only when Yantif comes on Erev Shabbat. And obviously, it's talking about 2 days. I just want to stop for a second and answer Sarah's question because it's very critical. If you don't understand this, then we're missing something big, which is you can't make an Erev Tavshilin on Yom Tov. That's for sure. The issue here is that you have 2 days of Yantif and only one of them, this goes back to our whole sugya about Sveika de Yoma. Only one of them is really Yantif. So that's why you can do it on condition, stipulation. If it's Yantif, then I'm not doing anything because I can't make an Erev on Yantif. If it's not Yantif, then I can do it. That's the whole point here. And with the Erev Tavshilin, if the second day is not Yantif, then of course you could cook to Shabbat. You know, we're on a working assumption that we're keeping both days, but because of Sveika de Yoma, we don't really know which day, but really one of the days is allowed. It's just like the Beitzah Shenolda. It's exactly where we went back. Why did they not make it the day before? There's only in a case where they forgot to make it the day before. That's what Rashi says. Im nizkar b'yom tov rishon. That was the first thing we read in Rashi. If you remembered on Yantif, meaning that you forgot to take care of it, then you can do it on these 2 days on condition. Okay, so I hope now it's clear. But with the Erev Tavshilin, you have to do 2 days, right? With the Erev, you have to do it only once. With the Erev Tchumen, you have to do it on both days because it has to be, right? One of the, it's for Shabbat, whereas the Erev Tavshilin is really for Friday. So you cook from Friday to Shabbat. But so 2 questions on Rashi. Why is the Erev Tchumen case a case of Erev Shabbat? It could just be that you want to make an Erev Tchumen for day number 2 of Yantif. And then also you could do it stipulating. You could either say, right, again, if today's Yantif, then tomorrow I'll be able to walk in this Erev is useless. I don't even need it because tomorrow I can leave the Tchum because it's not even Yantif. If tomorrow's Yantif, then today is really only Erev Yantif and then I can make an Erev. So Beitzah asks, theoretically, the Erev Tchumen should work, right? It would be the same thing. I don't know why Rashi says Shabbat only, really. The Erev Tavshilin is obviously only Shabbat because there is no such case of Erev Tavshilin when there's no Shabbat. And the second question he asks on Rashi is, why did Rashi insist that it's the same bread? Theoretically, you could take, okay, let me just go back to Erev Tchumen in case somebody doesn't know how we do Erev Tchumen. What we do in Erev Tchumen is we take bread and we place it somewhere outside our city from whatever point, right? It has to be within 2,000 cubits from where I live, from the outskirts of my city. I can put it down and say, this is where I want to establish my residence for Shabbat. And then you're allowed to walk 2,000 cubits from that spot, right? You could walk from your house to where you were Kona Shvita and another 2,000 cubits from that spot. So why would he need to use the same bread? Theoretically, you could use other bread. So those are 2 good questions on Rashi. Why you would do, right? Why he specifically says the same bread and why he specifically says Erev Shabbat, it's Shabbat, could theoretically work even if from Yom Tov to the other day of Yom Tov. Okay, that's this part. Now the Gemara says, remember, Rav Chia bar Ashi said you could do an Erev Tchumen miyom tov l'chaver, and Rava said you could do an Erev Tavshilin from one day to the other. So, but neither spoke about the other. So the question is, would they agree with the other one? So they say, Manda Amar Eruv Tchumen. If you say you can make an Erev Tchumen, kol sheken, of course, then you can make Erev Tavshilin on condition. But Manda Amar Erev Tavshilin, you can make on Yantif to the other day. Aval Erev Tchumen lo, my time de l'miknei shvita b'shabta lo. Says, when it comes to kinyan of shvita, meaning we're konesh shvita, we want to acquire a space, that's much more difficult to say that we can do on Yantif, even if it's Sveika de Yoma, right? It's difficult to say we are going to allow you to do that because that's actually making a kinyan. You're basically saying, I'm acquiring this space. This is like my house for the day. That's much more difficult. Like we said on the previous stuff, right? At the end of yesterday's stuff was about Erev Chatzerot and Erev Tchumen. Can you make them? They're both, we're doing some sort of kinyan. That's more of a problem on Yantif. Whereas Erev Tavshilin, there's no kinyan. I'm just saying I'm starting to cook, which is actually a permitted activity for that day, so that I can cook from Yantif to another day. So therefore, Rava, who said about Erev Tavshilin, would not necessarily agree that you could do it for Erev Tchumen. But Rav Chia bar Ashi says you could. Okay, right. And yes, I agree with you, Shoshana. You're saying that yesterday we said it's because you could do something that's permitted to do today on a different day that's not permitted. I don't know why the Gemara doesn't specifically bring that up, but I think maybe it's assuming, right? This is even a stronger case, right? Because it's a kinyan. It's very similar, really. It's kind of the same argument, just worded a little differently, I think. But I agree that there's an issue a little bit. It should have used the same language it used yesterday. Okay. Tanu Rabbanit. Ein ofim miyom tov lechavero. Now we're going to talk about how you can't cook. We already know this from one day of Yantif to the next. Be'emet amru, but however, okay, be'emet amru means truly they said, meaning this is a solution. You You could fill up an entire pot. You could put in tons of extra meat into your pot. You're cooking like a pot roast, stick in more meat, no problem, because really it's one act of cooking. You're cooking, the fact that you put extra meat in it doesn't really require much more effort. Continuing on, okay, a baker can fill up a whole pitcher, a barrel of water. It doesn't matter how much water he puts in, because again, you're boiling the water. It's one act of boiling the water. So theoretically, there are ways you could cook from one day to the other. But when it comes to baking, right, we all know if you make challahs, someone who makes challahs, it's much easier to make a 4-challah recipe than an 8-challah recipe, right? It's much easier because you have much less work to do, right? All you have to do, and you have to remember in those days, it wasn't just making the loaves, right, which takes time, but also there was this, what we called ridiyat pat. They would stick the bread on the sides of the oven and they had to pull it off. If you remember Masechet Shabbat, we called it like I forget the wording, but it was like something, it requires chokhmah to do it, right? It wasn't an easy action. It's like a malacha. So taking off the bread was a whole action, and then you have to take off each bread individually. So that's not going to be allowed on Yom Tov. Shaping them, forming them, right? The whole thing is much more difficult. Even the kneading is more work. So Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar disagrees. He says, you could fill your entire oven with bread. And maybe if there's someone who's a chef or knows from all these things, tell me if this is really true. It actually cooks better if you fill the whole oven with bread. First of all, I don't know if this would be true nowadays. Their ovens were different and the way they baked bread was different. So tough to know. You didn't need an expert in baking back in the times of the rabbis. But is this true, right? So he claims that it's actually better for the bread if you fill the whole oven, and therefore it's serving your needs today to add all sorts of other breads into the oven, and therefore you could even add breads according to him. Amarava halacha ke Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. We even paskin like him. So this kind of resolves your issue. If you want to cook from one day of Yom Tov to the other, you can add this extra because you're actually serving your needs for today, or you're not doing any really extra action when it comes to the cooking the meat and the water. Now they ask a question. And here, you might not have thought about this before, but the Gemara is going to ask this question. If you didn't make an eruv, do we say not only can you not bake for or cook for Shabbos, but not only that, but your ingredients, your flour is forbidden. Why would your flour be forbidden? So it seems like the reason it's forbidden is because it's muktzah potentially, right? If you don't plan to use it for Shabbat, then you can't, it's like not designated for use for Shabbat and you wouldn't be able to use it. Maybe, or maybe it's just that we have this isur that goes not only on you, but together along with your bread, with your flour. O Dilma, hu ne'asar ve'ein kimcho ne'asar. Or do we say, no, you can't do it, but your flour is not forbidden. Now, what does it mean if your flour is not forbidden? Lamai nafkamina. What's the relevance? La'aknuye kimcho la'achirim. It's in order to allow you to make your flour be acquired by somebody else, and then they be allowed to cook for you. Okay, how would this work? So what's the relevance? So let's read it. If you say it's forbidden for you and your flour, you have to transfer your flour to someone else. Okay, you'd have to transfer rights to your flour. Now, how could you do? It's a kinyan. How could you do a kinyan? Well, we allow kinyanim specifically for Simchat Yom Tov, right? We don't allow it to let you have an eruv tchumen or something, but we do allow it for Simchat Yom Tov. So, right, we've seen before, you could go to a store. So likewise, you can transfer ownership of your flour, and then someone else could cook for you. Now, according to this, you would have to say like this, right? In order to allow someone to cook for you, you'd have to transfer your flour to someone else. But if you say it's not forbidden, if your flour isn't forbidden, then all you have to do is give it to someone, and you don't have to transfer ownership of it. You just have to give it to him and he'll cook for you. Okay, there's no issue. So the Gemara asks, so what's the halacha? Tashma, can learn from here. The following source says, okay, that's what an Eruv permits you to do. So all these things you can't do. You can't bake for Shabbos, you can't cook, you can't heat up your water, right, and wrap it to keep it warm. Not for you, and you can't cook for others as well. And others can't cook for you either. So what is the only thing you can do? How can you resolve it? You can give rights to your flour to others, and they can cook for you or bake for you. Shmamina, what do we infer from here? Because the only way to do it is to transfer ownership rights. That's Rashi's explanation. Tosfot understands this totally differently and has a different girsa in the Gemara. Tosfot says, I have a few questions with Rashi. It says, number one, Ho'il, okay, I'm looking in the last Tosfot B'tema. Ho'il v'kim chone esar, ma mo'il afnei al acherim. If your flour is forbidden, again, it's not clear what is forbidden about it, but what does it help you to transfer it to somebody else? Your flour is forbidden. You shouldn't be allowed to transfer it to someone else. Right? In other words, if by transferring it to someone else, it doesn't take off the prohibition on this flour because you didn't designate it from before. And number two, he asks another good question, which is, what kind of craziness here? If it's forbidden for you to deal with this flour, how can we permit something to someone else that you yourself can't do? Right? I see someone wrote, this is a great way to get out of doing cooking, right? But that's what Tosfot says. What a ridiculous thing. We're going to say, you're forbidden, your flour is forbidden, and yet someone else can do what you can't do with your own flour? That seems crazy. So Tosfot says, based on the Bahag, of the halachot gedolot, only if you say your kemach isn't forbidden, then do we allow you to transfer it to somebody else, he says. If your flour is forbidden, there's no solution, basically. Then you can't transfer ownership. And then you'd have to say that the conclusion of this Gemara is the opposite, not shmami nahun esar v'kimchon esar, shmami nahun esar ve'ein kimchon esar. Your flour is not forbidden, and that's why you're allowed to transfer it to someone else. But if your flour is forbidden, there's no way you can't, that's not a resolution. So it's very interesting. I'm always interested when you see the same text, right, read differently. Part of it was the same version and read differently, and then one had a different version of the conclusion. Okay. Now we're moving on to the next question. And this question is we're going to deal with for a little while because we're going to bring 5 potential answers to the question. I'll tell you right now, none of them are going to work. Okay, we're going to bring 5 external sources, 5 Tanaitic sources to try to answer our question. Each time we're going to say it's not comparable. Avar va'afamai. What if you anyway cook on Yantif for Shabbos, even though you don't have an Eruv, right? Obviously, we're talking about a case where you don't live in a city where somebody kind of took care of it for you, or a case where, you couldn't rely on the fact that someone didn't write, that the rabbi of the community often does an Eruv, including everybody. But here's a case where, let's say you don't live in a community like that, and therefore you don't have anyone who did an Eruv for you. And you went and cooked anyway. So what's the status of that food? If you remember in Masechet Shabbat, we kept learning things like, what if you do malacha on Shabbat, right? What happens? Can you use it or not? Can you benefit? So Tashma, let's learn from here. Now you have to remember, there's a difference between this and Shabbat. Shabbat is deoraita, is forbidden by Torah law. And this, we already discussed, is only forbidden by rabbinic law. Okay, so Tashma, let's learn from here. The Beitzah says, this is what we just learned. You transfer ownership of your kemach to others. If you could have cooked anyway, right now, again, what does it mean of arva'afa? Well, you transgress the prohibition of cooking from Yantif to Shabbat, and you baked anyway. So they say, if the whole question was, what do you do in the case you didn't do an Eruv? And they said the only option you had is to transfer ownership of your flour to someone else and have them cook for you. Well, if this was a possibility that you could transgress and, you'd be allowed to eat your food, it should have listed here, well, if you did it anyway, it'd be permitted as a solution. Now the Gemara says, that's obviously not a solution because Amar Rav Ada bar Matna, Tana takanta dehetera katane. The Tana was only giving you permitted options. Permitted options, right, are go transfer rights, ownership rights of your flour to your friend and let your friend cook for you. But he certainly wasn't giving you a list of, well, transgress the prohibition and then you'll be allowed to eat your food. No, it certainly wasn't going to give you that listed. Okay, I'm just trying to follow the chat a little bit, and I see, what are we missing about Bishul Akum? No, Bishul Akum, we're not talking about giving it to a Gentile. We're talking about giving it to a Jew. That's the issue here, okay? I guess you're saying if he's living in a place where there's no Eruv or no one did an Eruv, what Jew is he giving it to? But again, you could say there were Jews in the community that did an Eruv, but there was no community leader who had everyone in mind. And that I assume that's why you're asking the question. If you have more questions about it, ask in the chat and I'll try to follow. But the idea here is you're not giving it to a Gentile to cook for you. You're giving it to a Jew to cook for you because another Jew who made an Eruv is allowed to cook on Yantif. Okay. So if something wasn't clear, let me know. Second source, Tashma. Let's learn from here. Okay. The first part isn't really going to be relevant. It's only going to be the last line. If you made an erev tafshilin, right? So then you're allowed to bake, cook, do hatmana, right? Wrap the hot water that you boiled, wrap it to keep it hot. And if you want to eat your erev harashupi adon, no problem. Just what? Right? But if you ate it before you did your cooking, and as you can eat your erev, but only after you did your cooking. You can't eat it before you did your cooking. If you did, you wouldn't be able to cook, not for you, not for others, etc. And others wouldn't be able to cook for you as well. What's the only thing you could do? Cook for Yantif. And if you happen to have extra, great, you can eat that food on Shabbat. That's all you can do. But you have to be careful not to use any sort of trickery here. Meaning, the fact that we say if you have leftover, you can eat it on Shabbos doesn't mean you can add tons of extra just to have for Shabbat. Okay, even though we saw before, maybe you could, but this source says, no, you can't. V'im ha'erim asur. And if you did that ha'arama, you'd be forbidden to eat that food on Shabbos. So if I pretend, maybe something will happen and who knows, someone's going to show up and I better make lots and lots of food, right? Really, your intent is Shabbat and not Yantif. Well, that you can't do. Okay, so right, this is right. Forgetting about Jewish mothers, I see Geeks is making reference, right? Who always had lots of food, but they mean beyond. Like I would assume this means if you would normally cook that for Yantif, no problem, right? I have, people in my family who cook, tons of quantities, and if it lasts them for the week, and so maybe you could say something like that, someone who normally does it, whereas I don't cook as large quantities, for me, it would be more of an issue. So if that's the case, it's forbidden. So what do they assume? Well, if you can't eat when you do ha'arama, obviously then if you went against and cooked, right, it seems to be the same thing. It would be forbidden. And that would teach you it's forbidden. To which we're going to have two rejections of this source, two different types of rejections also methodologically. Amar Rav Ashi, ha'arama ka'amalt, shani ha'arama da'achmiru ve'rabanan tfei mezid. Ha'arama is not the same as saying, I'm going to cook on Yantif for Shabbos, I don't care, right? There's a difference. What's the difference? Okay, this is very interesting and it makes a lot of sense. I'm going to read in Rashi. Shane ha'arama, why? La'olam avar va'afa mutal, right? You could say, again, we don't know, but you could say, even with this source, if you transgress, you can still eat it. Why? The ha'arama in araya lakan. You can't learn from harama. Tishane ha'arama mezid. Harama is different from mezid. Why? To ikalamemer, one could say, achmor ba'rabanan ba'harama tfemi mezid. The rabbis were more strict with it. Why? To ilu mezid, rashahu la'avor al divrei chachamim. When you do something intentionally, you know it's wrong and you don't care. Well, it's actually, you're in a better place. Why? Because you're a rasha, right? You're basically a bad person who went against the rabbis. So why would that make you in a better position? Two reasons. And one is very relevant to Yom Kippur. So coming off of Yom Kippur, you'll like this. Number one, yes, less relevant for Yom Kippur. First of all, others are going to say, oh, he transgressed on purpose. I'm not going to go learn from his actions. And number two, and likely you'll do tshuva on it because you'll know you did something wrong. At some point in life, you'll be remorseful about it and you'll do tshuva. You'll repent. Therefore, you're not actually saying, right, there's no such thing as erev tafshilin. You're saying, I don't care. That's different. That's better almost. Okay. and therefore maybe they didn't penalize you. Aval ma'arim, but if you do this trickery, savor la'asot behetir, you think you're doing something that's allowed. That's way worse. Why? For the exact opposite of those two reasons. Hilkach lo yashiva libo lachzor bo. You're not going to try to repent because you don't think you did anything wrong, right? You justify. This is like the worst when you justify and say, it's really okay that I'm doing this. It's the worst. Number one, you yourself are never going to do tshuva because you don't really think you did anything wrong. Number two, other people are going to learn from your actions because they're going to think that you did it in a permitted way, and then they'll think it's permitted. And then people are going to think, oh, we don't really need to do Eruv Tafshilin because we could just do Ha'arama and we're fine. And therefore, Hilkach Kansu Rabbanit. Therefore, the rabbis penalized you, right? And they said, well, we're not going to allow you to do this. Because remember, Midoraita, it's really allowed. So theoretically, they could have said, look, if you did it already, we'll let it go. So therefore, they say, we're going to distinguish. It's very fascinating logic, right? It makes a lot of sense. The haram is actually worse than transgressing on purpose. Even though you would think, right, at first glance, you'd say, definitely it's worse to do something intentional. You know it's wrong. You do it anyway, rather than, justifying. So there's two dangers here, which are very interesting dangers, what other people will think, and for your own sake, will you actually ever repent? That's one approach to say, oh, this is talking about harama, we're talking about mezid, those are not the same thing. The second approach is to say, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar, oh, this source is not halacha. It's not the main halachic opinion. This source is Hananiah's reading of Beit Shammai. He had a very strict reading of Beit Shammai, and it's Beit Shammai. So for sure, we don't hold this way, and then we're not going to learn from this anything because it's not a source that we hold by. What's strange about his approach is that he's going to bring a source about Hananiah, which has nothing to do with this particular case that was mentioned in this Beitzah. It's just showing that Hananiah has a more stringent approach of Beit Shammai, and because he holds that Beit Shammai has a more stringent approach than we've seen until now, maybe we could claim that this source is this stringent approach that we see in Hananiah. Okay, so it's not 100% connected, but that's the connection. So what does he read here? What does he bring us? Hananiah's position. Detanya, as it says in the Beitzah, Hananiah omer, Beit Shammai omrin ein ofil elin ken yirev bepat, ve'ein mevashlim elin ken yirev betavshil, ve'ein tumunim elin ken hayuchamim tumunim me'erev yom tov. He says that Beit Shammai holds you need to have bread to allow you to bake. You need to have water to allow you to boil water, and you need to have a cooked dish to allow you to cook. Okay, you have to have your air very specific. Beit Hillel omrim arev betavshil echad. All you need is one cooked item, and that covers everything. Okay, we'll get a little bit to halacha l'maaseh in a few minutes. Okay, so now, based on that, we see as a strict approach of Beit Shammai, and therefore we're going to assume that we could say that source also is maybe Hananiah's position of Beit Shammai, and therefore we don't learn from it anything. So back to square one. Do we have a source that can prove whether or not you can eat this food? Tanan says in the Mishnah, "Ha'maaser perotav b'Shabbat b'shogeg yochal b'mezid lo yochal." If you take maasrot from your fruits on Shabbat, which rabbis decreed you're not allowed to do, right? It looks like you're fixing your food. We learned that already. If you did it unintentionally, you can eat it. If you did it purposely, you're not allowed to eat it. So why don't we say the same thing here? So they say, Lo tzricha dile pereach rine. Now that must be it, right? Normally you have other fruits and vegetables to eat. That's why we don't permit it. But here you have nothing else cooked to eat for Shabbos, so you might permit it. Next source, same idea. Tashma, and this is from our next Mishnah. Hamatbil kelav b'Shabbat. It's not a quote from the next Mishnah, but it's the topic of the next Mishnah. That you can't tovel dishes, kelim, utensils on Shabbat. But if you did anyway, b'shogeg yishtamesh b'hem, you can use them if you did it unwittingly. B'mezi, but if you did it intentionally, lo yishtamesh b'hem, you can't use them on Shabbat. So here again, you see intentional. Can't use it on Shabbat. Also, it's d'Rabbanan. We'll see all the reasons why they forbade it in tomorrow's daf. We could say the same thing about the fruits. You might have other utensils to use, and that's why we don't permit it. Inami, alternatively, you can also borrow from someone utensils. Right? You can't borrow their food. They need their food to eat, but you could borrow utensils. Okay. Tashma. Again, this shows Jewish moms maybe didn't cook as much in those days because, right, otherwise you could borrow from a friend because your friend probably made extra. Right? I imagine they didn't have as much money in those days, at least the average person, and therefore maybe didn't cook as much as we think of nowadays. Last source, Tashma hamevashel b'Shabbat b'shogeg yochal b'mezid lo yochal. I may reference this before. If you cook on Shabbat, again, unintentionally you cook, it's okay, you can eat it, but intentionally you're not allowed to eat it. So again, here they say what I said earlier, which is Isur de Shabbat Shani. No, Isur b'Shabbat is different because it's much more strict, right? It's Deoraita, it's Torah law, and therefore you can't learn from there to here. Okay, continuing on. Beit Shammai omrim shnei tafshilin. In our Mishnah, it said that Beit Shammai say 2 tafshilin, but Hillel said 1. But now we're going to have a different version again of the Mishnah. This is a continuing theme and throughout our Masechet. Manitin de Loki Haitana. Our Mishnah is not like the following Tana, Tanya, and it's often, not always, but often Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Right, I forgot to mention, by the way, Isur Shabbat is also karet. Thank you for reminding me, Gita, that it's another reason why it's more strict. But even without that, the Doraita would be sufficient enough to say so. Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, Modim Beit Shammai uBeit Hillel al shnei tafshilin shetzarich. In our Mishnah, it was a machloket, 2 or 1. Here it says they both agree that you need 2. What's their machloket? And in our Mishnah, it said they all agree about the dagu beitzah, which we said was weird because the fish and the egg. How could you say they all agree when Beit Hillel says you only need 1? He doesn't really need to say the egg and the fish are considered 2 because he doesn't even need 2. But here it actually makes a little more sense. Here it says that's specifically the debate between them. Al dagu beitzah sha'alav, the fish with the egg on top of it. Shebeit Shammai omrim shnei tafshilin. Now, it's a little tricky. What it means is Beit Shammai says you need shnei tafshilim, and this only counts as 1. Ubeit Hillel omrim tafshil echad. This 1 tafshil could count as 2, and therefore it's good. B'shavin, however, they both agree, she'im prepare beitzah v'natan l'toch hadag, o she'riseh kaplotot v'natan l'toch hadag she'en shnei tafshilim. They both agree that if you stuck the egg inside the fish, or you stuck leeks, you crushed leeks and stuck it in the fish, some dish that they used to make, then that would all be considered 1 cooked dish. It's only when the egg is on top, the way we were talking about the other day, right? You kind of take a sunny side up egg and throw it on top, or a cooked egg and you put it on top, then it will be shnei tafshilin, but not like this. The halacha is like our Mishnah, which is Beit Hillel only requires 1 tafshil, and that's how we hold. Okay, this is very strange. Why is this very strange? Because we don't actually hold this way. What do? We use bread and an egg, right? Now, bread isn't 2 tafshilim, but it is something else, right? We normally use matzah, many people use, and a hard-boiled egg. That's generally what's used. So I just want to read this quick, interesting Tosfot, even though we're kind of running out of time, but it's just too interesting not to read. So here goes. Tosfot says, in Amar Rava, the second line, Omer Rabbeinu Tam de la'afiyat tzarich la'arev gam bepat. He says, if you want to bake, you need bread. And that's why we have bread and an egg. The egg permits you to cook, and the bread permits you to bake. So he says, and it's based on Rabbi Eliezer, who said, Ein ofin ela ala foy ve'ein mevashlim ela al mavushal. It's not based on Beit Shammai before, who said you need water for, right? He doesn't say, by the way, you need water for boiling. He says cooked dish covers all cooking, and bread covers all that. If you look at the bottom of Tosfot, about 10 lines from the bottom, it says, V'lo nireh laharav Rabbeinu Yitzchak. The Ri, basically Balei Tosfot, the 2 main ones with the Ri and Rabbeinu Tam. The Ri says, it doesn't really seem to be that way because it really holds from here. It sounds like Tafshil Echad. It doesn't seem to say you need bread also. And he says, the fact that they brought Rabbi Eliezer is not really lahalacha, and he basically rejects Rabbeinu Tam. However, the last 2 lines are the most interesting. The Rabbeinu Tam is his uncle. He says, I'm not really comfortable disagreeing with my uncle. He gives 2 reasons. Number 1, I don't want to go against my uncle. Number 2, this is what people are doing. Everyone's doing it like this, so it must be they're right. So he has 2 reasons, which are both even independent of each other, might be factors, but the combination convinces him, and that's why we have our custom today. So I thought that was just interesting to show. And now let's finish up our daf. If you eat it or it gets lost, you can't cook anymore. But if you already started cooking, and then, or you're baking, and you're in the middle of kneading your dough, and your kid in the kitchen goes and eats the food. Okay, you forgot to tell everyone in the house, this is my eruv, right? Don't eat it. He eats it. Since you already started, it will be a hefsed to lose that. It will be a loss to lose that whole dough. We allow you to finish the process. Okay. Mishnah. Chaliot achar Shabbat. What if Yantif comes out on Sunday? Now, people before Yantif in the times of the temple wanted to become pure before the holiday and get all their vessels purified because they were going to eat sacrificial meat, right? They were bringing all these korbanot and they were going to eat the meat, and they needed to be pure, and their vessels needed to be pure. So what if you want to purify the day before is Shabbat, are you allowed to? Beit Shammai omrim matbilin et hakol lefnei Shabbat. Everything has to be done, your kelim, everything before Shabbat. Beit Hillel omrim kelim lifnei Shabbat va'adam b'Shabbat. Your vessels have to be done before Shabbat, but a person can tovel on Shabbat. This, you're going to have to wait to see tomorrow's daf what the reason is. Vishavim, and they agree, and I'll kind of mention this case, we'll see it again tomorrow, so if you don't exactly get it, it's a weird thing to understand, but they both agree, tomorrow we're going to see it's a case where you only have this water for drinking, it's the only water you have, and your water became impure and you want to purify it. So the way you can do it is put it in a stone bowl or a cup or whatever it is. Why stone? Because it's not susceptible to impurity. Dunk it in the mikvah, put it down like face up. As it does hashaka, it touches, the top of your water touches the water in the mikvah. That's a method that you can purify water. So since you need it for drinking, we're going to allow you to purify water in this way, but avaloma to be lean. But you can't use an impure vessel and while you're dunking it in the mikvah with your water and say, oh, well, now my vessel will become pure. That you can't do. Again, we'll see tomorrow why this is a problem. And matbilim migav legav umichavua lechavua. This we're going to have to wait till daf yud tet, 2 days to understand better. But if you tovel something with one intent in mind, you can then tovel it again on Shabbos for a different intent, or you toveled it for one chabura, like for Pesach, to use in one group, and then you want to use it for a different group, you tovel it again, why you have to tovel it twice, and all the details of this we're going to get into on Daf Yud Tet, so we'll wait till there to understand. I'll just a sneak preview to tomorrow, we're going to see 4 different reasons as to what the possible problem of toveling on Shabbos is. Okay, that's for tomorrow. So it's good for Shabbat to learn something related to Shabbat. And with that, we'll finish for today. Everyone. Shana Tova, Shabbat Shalom, all of those things.